about our blog. But, so yeah, that's it from me. And again, sorry that we've taken so much time before giving the floor, as it were, to Ken. I'm really excited to hear from Ken, but let me stop sharing my screen now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. So it's now my pleasure really to just introduce Ken. Ken is very, very popular figure in Zimbabwean conservation and agriculture. I was saying to him just earlier on that when I was at university, I still remember the name Ken Giller from those days. And so it's good to have him come and speak to us about some of his work. He is professor of plant production systems at Wageningen University. He has been a professor at London University and at the University of Zimbabwe. His expertise covers conservation, cropping systems, nitrogen cycle, nutrient flow systems, analysis, and land use. And some of you may have read his textbook, Nitrogen Fixation in Tropical Cropping Systems. He's been prolific in his scientific publications, and so I know that many of you have read some of his work, and a few of you are probably students, past students of his. So we're really, really excited. He continues to maintain an interest in Zimbabwe, for which we're very grateful for many of us from Zimbabwe. That Ken still does that. And so very excited to have him present to us on people living on the edge. So thank you, Ken, and over to you.
So thanks, MX. I think your introduction simply means I'm old, because I've done all those things, yeah? But really great to be invited. I'm so delighted to be able to talk to you all today. Before I get too far going, I'd like to recognize some people who are already on the call, and particularly Michel Degarin-Mitotitsky, who's based now in Thailand, who is running the RPCP, I always get confused, the RPPCP, or whatever it's called, with Sirad and colleagues. My last visit outside the Netherlands was actually, I was in Zimbabwe with Fred Baudron, with Priska Mugabe at the University of Zimbabwe last February. I was traveling every month, actually, roughly into Africa in different parts for our work until the lockdown, and I'm feeling extremely locked down. So it's wonderful to be able to engage with you all here about these really important issues for conservation in Zimbabwe. And I'm delighted to see the enthusiasm of this young team running this chapter of the Society of Conservation Biology, because I really think you can play a great role. So I chose this title, People Living on the Edge, and what I'll be talking about is very much to do with what's in this book, a book which was a joint production from our project from the University of Wageningen University, and our colleagues from the RPCP. So without further ado, this was our project, Competing Claims on Natural Resources. And when I was checking it out, it's actually 10 years ago since the project officially ended. But that doesn't mean we haven't been busy since. And so a lot of what I'll be talking about will be a retrospective to work we did then and work we've been doing since, and maybe what all of this means then for conservation in a broader sense in Zimbabwe and in the whole region and beyond. So we had this title, Competing Claims on Natural Resources, and this came out actually of a whole discussion and debate about multifunctional land use and land sharing. And we realized that a lot of that is not always so pleasant. It's often about the competition for resources, the competition for land, and these competing claims on land and other natural resources. Now, we were working then in these transfrontier conservation areas, particularly in the Greater Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area. So the area down at the down here, Granaries, Kruger, Limpopo, Limpopo, but also here in the Midzanbazi Valley. And Fred Baudron's online, and Fred shared a seminar with us yesterday, which was actually in Wageningen in my group, a 10-year retrospective and update on his work in the Midzanbazi Valley, and I hope he'll be able to present in this series soon. It was interesting when I was looking at who's been speaking so far, because Prof. Dave Cumming was an editor with us on this book, and he gave the first, I think, in this seminar series. And I'd recognize as well Prof. Edson Gandiwa, who did his PhD actually as part of the competing claims program in Granaries. So this was the time, this is from 2008 from the AHEAD group, about this whole idea of bringing down the fences, allowing wildlife to move between the national parks. Very much a time, if you like, of trying to rethink the idea of protected areas. And obviously there was a big focus of our CIRAD colleagues, Alex Caron, who's on the call, Michel Degarin, and others, about diseases and disease transmission between wildlife and livestock. And that was a big focus of this AHEAD program who produced this report. And just as an aside, there was a lot of similar things happening here in the Netherlands. This is a thing called the Veluwe route. So this is actually a plan to connect up all the different national parks around the areas where we live here, right away up into the polders further north, to allow then wild animals, deer, these wild horses you see on the left, to actually roam between these areas, including wolves and hogs and everything. And here we are with our team from Zimbabwe and South Africa and Mozambique, actually on a very cold day in winter, looking at one of these areas with wild horses grazing nature. I have to say that since this enthusiasm 10 to 15 years ago, this plan has been cancelled because of human-wildlife conflict. And it no longer exists, this idea of actually having these wildlife corridors, simply due to the conflict that there is between members of the public, between farmers, and between nature. Keep that in mind as we go forward. So we were working around this idea of if we want to look at the bottom of this diagram here, where we're looking at local responses, which are dependent very much on local resources, we have to see that in a global context, because we've got global treaties, we've got the CBD, we've got international trade. They're translated down into regional national forces, they're translated down again into more local forces, land tenure rights, politics, etc. And that actually dictates what can go on down here at the bottom. But the feedbacks are really very weak. The whole idea of democratic influence from local level up to regional level, up to global level, the feedbacks are weak. There's a lot of pressures constraining the space within which activities can occur. And this book basically, and I'll refer to a series of different chapters. The photo on the front here is a photo of the wildlife fence around Malapati, close to Granaries. It was taken by Crispin Murungweni, who's now, I think, Dean at the University in Chimoio. And you can see actually there's no wire between the fence, and there are some kids here walking along. These are very porous edges. When we talk about the edge, we're not talking about a hard edge here. We talked very much in the book about these being very fluid edges, but very much being on the edge of the country as well. And this quote here, national parks, they were established in sparsely populated, disease-ridden marginal lands which were declared unfit for agricultural development. Now that says immediately something about the conditions within which people live if they're living on the edge. I want to refer now to some work which was done actually in and around the Limpopo National Park. And Limpopo National Park was actually a hunting reserve, the Kutada 16. It was a hunting concession where basically it was then merged with Kruger and Ganarejo to form the Greater Limpopo Transfrontier Park and as part of the broader conservation area. And when you visit this, and this is this was the plan then, the map of the park, and each of these little red dots is a village, and you can see a lot of villages along the Limpopo River, but also along the Shingwedzi River here, which is a seasonally dry river in the center of the park, and obviously the villages there due to access to water. The statistics I remember is that there were 26,000 people living in the park when it was declared, 7,000 of them actually in this area along the Shingwedzi. And then we have a plan here for a low use zone, a buffer zone or support zone along the river, a low density tourism zone, medium to high density here coming through from the Kruger side, with the idea that all of the people along the Shingwedzi would actually be resettled outside the park into areas actually where there were already a lot of people. And visiting the park then back in around 2007, 2008, this is what you see: herds of cattle, crops of maize along the river, and close to the gate, of course, what's been harvested by the rangers in terms of the snares and traps, which we use for what could be called local resource exploitation, hunting, which could be called, of course, poaching, depending on your perspective. So we wanted to ask this question, well, how have people really adapted to this harsh agroecological environment and to the climate variability? Here's a picture taken from a gyrocopter, actually by Jessica, looking down at the village where she was conducting her work. And Jessica Milgram, a PhD student working with me, actually lived in this village for about a year in the Limpopo National Park. It's close then to the Shingwedzi River, which is this dry river here. And we have this paper here called Courting the Rain, Rethinking Seasonality and Adaptation to Drought. And what she found was, whereas in those of you who know Zimbabwe knows that everybody plants their maize around November, December, you know, particularly people go home for Christmas and continue planting. It's their contribution to the rural home is to plant maize. But in this park, there was no fixed planting season. We actually had continuous planting whenever there was rain, planting outside the rainy season, with these adaptation then to seasonal irregularities, climate change on top of it, and taking advantage of topography where you'd have water running on into lowland areas. So here we have some different crops, May, February, April, different crops planted at different times of the year, which we as agriculturalists, you would think is absolutely crazy, to be honest. And what we found then is that people were planting with every rain. So it's a response farming. It's farming in the hope of getting a different crop. And what you see here is, for a series of different years, a reconstruction of the different plantings in relation to their yield. And the ones with these yellows here are actually plantings that resulted in crop yield. The other ones had no yield at all. So you can see in this year, there were 560 millimeters of rain in total, and some very good harvests. The year after, only 274 millimeters, only one harvest. In this year, the 2006, 2017, none of the plantings yielded anything. And here in 2009, 2 of the plantings. So very uncertain environment. And what do people do in terms of response? Well, basically, they plant as much area as they can. So as soon as it rains, they plow as much as they can, they plant as much as they can in the hope that it will yield. And here we are in the village with the granaries. So granaries are absolutely essential, of course, because if you only harvest in one year, you want to carry over the maize into the year after. And here we've got a traditional granary, and here is the more modern one, which nowhere near as beautiful, but with a metal roof here, and lots of stored maize. But on top of the problems there, we then had the advent of the large grain borer. And this is what basically happened. Traditional granaries, which, as you can see here, are actually much better sealed, could actually preserve the grain against this post-harvest insect pest. Whereas the modern granaries, you can see total devastation of the maize by this new pest, which had just come in around that time in the late, around 2007, 2008, and it was actually new in the region. So a very hand-to-mouth existence in terms of farming. And if this is what you've got left in the granary to eat, well, of course, it's not particularly palatable. And what we find, here's some research done at my kitchen table using Google Earth, a wonderful tool. You can see then that agriculture particularly focused in these alluvial soils along the rivers. This is actually the confluence of the Xinguedzi River and the Rio Olifantes, the Olifants River, at the south of the park. And this is what we see, of course. The riverbeds are then very much a focus for livestock. They're very important for wildlife as well. And of course, they're important for the villagers. And here's Jessica with her host family actually getting the water for cooking in the evening from the dry riverbed when you needed then to dig to actually have water available. And we see this also, this is a slide actually from the Sengwe area in between Kruger and Gonarejo. Lots of cropping in these alluvial soils along the rivers. And of course, these are very much a focus for wildlife and for livestock during the dry season. I saw that Stephen Matema is on the call. He's also got a paper currently in, I hope, just about accepted in the African Journal of Ecology, actually looking at track counts and things in relation to wildlife in the Midzanbazi Valley. And what do we see then? Of course, agriculture is also focused in these areas. Here we've got an irrigation pump on a sledge here, pumping water from the river then for use in crops alongside the river. This is along the Olifantes to the south of the Limpopo Park. Here's some slides I took when I was walking long distances in the Midzanbazi Valley with Fred Baudron. These beautiful areas of Phaidebia albida, again on these alluvial soils, very much a focus here for sorghum production, very much an area where a lot of wildlife would also be grazing at different times, particularly during the dry season. And a slide that I took from Fred from a talk he gave yesterday, and he's just done a study of the Midzanbazi Valley following up from his PhD work there, which really emphasizes the costs of living with wildlife. And I remember very much in the 3 years or so we were active in the Midzanbazi Valley around 2008, I think there were 14 people killed by lion. Now what you see here is the injuries and deaths due to crocodile, elephant, snakes, hippos, buffalo, lions, etc. And in the Midzanbazi Valley, these figures then, 4 people dying each year, injuries, lots of cattle being lost, small ruminants, granaries being lost, and crops being lost. And Stephen Matema, who's had this paper with Jens Andersen, looking at the human-wildlife conflict, it's in the Journal of Modern African Studies, where basically, when people thought about the problems of lions, they actually associated them with external influence in the area. Not so much a problem of the lions, more a problem of people from outside who were actually bringing these problems. It's very interesting to read these perceptions of local people on the problems of human-wildlife conflict. Now, I want to flick back to a study that Chris Murungweni did, and Chris was working in the Southeast Lowveld in the area around Malapati to Sengwe. And what he did was he tried to understand the livelihoods of people living in these areas around the parks, living in what was very close to being the new elephant corridor, supposedly from Granaries to Kruger. And here we have, of course, this is a fuzzy cognitive map, but just think of all these different things. So which influence their livelihood. Obviously, we've got cattle here. We've got use of jomve, which was actually a plant to actually help cattle overcome drought. But to summarize this, what he basically found, there were livelihoods of people who had a lot of cattle. They used that cattle basically to produce cash, and that cash was actually gave them their food. They actually had very little in the way of cropping. We had other households who were more crop cattle based. So they had a lot of goats and sheep, shoats. They had quite a lot of harvest coming from the vlays, so the lowland areas along the rivers, as well as some upland crops. So they basically had both livestock and crops, and that basically gave them cash and food. But we also had a lot of other livelihoods in the area, which were really non-farm based. They were basically households living primarily from remittances, producing cash, which then gave them the food. They were basically dependent on buying food with very little cropping themselves. So although we often look at households in these areas and we think of them as being farming households, as smallholder farmers, they're actually households with very diverse livelihoods. And they're very extended livelihoods. If we look here, we very nearly always found we were talking to women and children in these villages. This is in Sengwe. There were virtually no men present because, of course, the men were mainly down south, across the border, working for money, which was then coming back into the household in the locality. And this is really nothing new. Sorry, my presentation. Here we go. Here we are standing under the sign to Crook's Corner, because of course the confluence, the junction between Mozambique, Zimbabwe and South Africa was always a smuggling route. It was always a place where people were going across this porous border for different purposes in order to actually support their livelihoods. And migration across borders has been a facet of life in Southern Africa for more than a century, really going back into the 1800s. There was labor migration already to South Africa from Malawi, from Mozambique, from Zambia, all the way through Zimbabwe and down to work in the mines, etc. So a conclusion from a chapter that I led in our book is summarized here, that the population and the livelihoods on these edges is really driven by the lack of opportunity elsewhere. We have this quote, the allure and security of paid employment relative to the lack of opportunity locally. They act as a magnet. They're pulling men and youth away from the edge. And Marshall Murphy, who I heard talk at one of the last AHEAD meetings I attended in Hwange, which must have been, I think, in 2015. Can't remember exactly. But Marshall actually really pointed to this conclusion, saying that if we want to understand conservation around our parks, we have to recognize that the general economic situation and the lack of employment outside of those areas is as much as important as looking locally at what's going on directly in those areas. Because of course, if you pull people away and pull their attention away from the park itself, then of course, it's because people have got other livelihood opportunities. Now, I want to switch to a piece of work here. This is a bit complicated, where a colleague of mine, Katrien de Scheemak, has been working with Patricia Mascati and other people down in Bulawayo around Matopos, and looking at what would happen in the more dryland areas of Zimbabwe if we think about transformative change. And of course, we're working around the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. We're talking about transformative change of our different systems. And basically here with a series of indicators around what we'd call a conventional development, so just using intensification with technologies versus on this side, on the right, we've got a transformative change, which is really thinking of all the possible things we could do. He muted me. To improve the situation in terms of markets, in terms of institutions, as well as technologies. We've got these two different scenarios. So one is, if you like, the typical way we think about change. The other is trying to think of everything we could do to improve the situation. So a sustainable development versus a transformative development. Now, here we have a current situation in southern Zimbabwe. We're talking about the current situation, an incremental or a transformative situation. Sorry. So we're talking here about households which are really poor with no cattle. In yellow, households who got 1 to 8 cattle, and then wealthier households who have more than 8 cattle. So cattle being an indicator of wealth. And you can see here the net returns then depend on the current situation, the incremental situation, or the transformative situation. And what's really shocking here is if we convert this though into poverty levels, so the number of households above the poverty line or not, we can see that according to our institutional norms, our international norms, basically even the wealthier households here, 90% of them under the current situation actually fall below the international poverty line in terms of their general income from farming. The incremental transformation then would actually reduce that incidence of poverty here for the wealthier households, has very little effect actually for the poorer households or these intermediate households. And the transformative pathway has a strong effect for the medium households, for the wealthier households, but again, very little impact for these extremely poor households. Very often single-headed households, often single women with children. Now, this is really a very, very stark result, and one which I think is so crucial for our thinking about the future and how we actually deal, if you like, with improving livelihoods around parks in relation to the conservation objectives. Now, I want to take this a bit further, because we've done this type of analysis, and much of my work is not specifically related to areas around conservation, but looking at other types of farming systems across Africa, and we work in West, East, and Southern Africa. This was a study where we pulled together household survey data for 13,000 farms, and it's published in PNAS. At the bottom here, this is a rolling mean for these 13,000 farms, 93 sites, 17 countries. And what we find is the different activities, so consumption of crops, sold cash crops, livestock, or off-farm income. And what we have here at this line is the threshold for food self-sufficiency. Now, 37% of the households across, sorry, I keep hearing some things. 37% of households are food insecure, and this is across this 13,000 households across different sites. So food insecurity is really a key problem in rural Africa in general. But where people and households are doing well, you see the importance here in black of off-farm income is absolutely crucial. So this idea that farmers or households depend just on farming is something we really need to escape from. Now, we've taken this work further into this idea of a living income for different households. So instead of thinking just about the poverty line, what is the income that people would need to have a decent standard of living? Not be wealthy, but just have actually access to the basic human rights. So that's the human right to food, the human right to shelter, to housing, the human right to health, here in the middle, to healthcare, the human right to education. So these are what we call the non-food, non-housing benefits, and then other things like clothing, And if we add these together, the cost of food, the cost of housing, the cost of non-food, non-housing, so education and healthcare, and then a small margin of 5 to 10%, that would give us what we call a living income. We've got a paper here, which is a quick benchmarking method for this. And what we find is a living income is actually something like 2 to 3 times the poverty line that people would need. So something in the order, if you express it in US dollars, of around $5 to $6 a day, rather than the 1.9 absolute poverty line. And for one site here, and we've got lots of this data, but I'll just show you this one. It's for the Western Simbarra Mountains in Tanzania, where we've done a lot of work. It's a very high potential area with 2 cropping seasons a year. You'll see actually here, the households again lined up with increasing income against the poverty line, and something in the order of 40% of households are above the poverty line, but living income is only achieved by about 17% of the households, and most of those have a large dependence on off-farm income. What does that mean for us as agriculturalists? And this is for some work we've been doing across many countries looking at legumes. Well, we have some technologies, things like this short duration cowpea. It grows very quickly, it yields quickly, it allows crops to be harvested during the hunger season. So that's during the rains, but before the harvest. It helps very much with household nutrition. So there are things as agriculturalists we can do to actually alleviate issues of hunger and poor nutrition, but none of these are actually going to give people a living income directly. Now, I want to summarize here some conclusions and then open up for discussion. Well, what does all this mean for conservation? And I want to hear your views on that. But basically, to summarize, if you like, the work that we've been involved in relation to livelihoods living on the edge, what we find are the current gains in productivity or in agriculture in Africa generally are being totally overtaken by the rise in population. Population growth rate in Africa is still going on at 2 to 3%, so doubling every 20 years, whereas our increases in agricultural production and yields are lagging way behind that. We find that the land along the rivers is very much the focus of competition, and coping during drought is critical for households living in these marginal areas, and that these diverse and extended livelihoods are very important to understand in relation to their dependence on local resources. So we shouldn't just be focusing on finding opportunities for people close to the parks. We should be looking at how we can develop opportunities for them also to move away and to be less dependent on those areas. So we're very much tied up with the national economy as a whole. So enhancing livelihoods, then, it needs alternatives, it needs opportunities. And of course, these are multiple: agriculture, ecotourism, benefit sharing from hunting, such as the campfire program. And I think that Edwin Gandiwa already gave a talk about this idea of community-based natural resource management at your last seminar. Also encouraging out-migration from these areas. So it's a multi-scale, it's a multi-level, multiple actor, multiple approaches problem. And when we come back to these broader debates about land sparing and land sharing, much of what we see in the areas close to the national parks in different places is very poorly productive agriculture. And that means that each household needs and does use much more land than you might wish. So ideally, we need an intensification of agriculture to actually get more production per unit area, to actually dissuade people from using too large an area. Although that's, of course, quite complex in areas where there's a lot of drought. And I think that this is a topic that Fred Baudron's work particularly addresses, and he's got a lot to say on this. And I think it would be great to get him back for one of these seminars in the near futures. But both of these approaches are needed: land sparing, land sharing, depending on local needs and opportunities. We need landscape mosaics, corridors, patterns, protected areas, and those options and solutions will differ depending on where we are. But we need much more engagement of agricultural development, because these are so inextricably intertwined and need protected areas. So I'd like to leave you with thank very much to the co-authors on this work. And Jens Andersen was somebody who contributed enormously to this book, but also to the other projects we had there. But these are the final sentences of our chapter here. And I'll just read it out to you. Wild nature remains emblematic for Africa. Global support for conservation strong, but the burden of living with wildlife rests firmly on the shoulders of local people. So is it not time that the global community should bear the true costs of conservation and offer realistic alternatives for people living on the edge? And it's really a plea to all of those people in wealthy countries who love to sit and watch movies of National Geographic or whatever of beautiful wild animals in Africa, or to come and visit Africa to do ecotourism, that really they need to also, if they want to see the conservation of these areas for the long term, we as a global community need to bear the costs and not put those costs purely on the shoulders of the people who live there. So thanks very much, MX. That's what I have to say. And I'd love to hear some discussion and responses from people. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Ken. That's been brilliant, thought-provoking. And for many of us who work on the front line of conservation, actually, this presents some evidence that we've got to really think through some of our interventions and proposals. Want to encourage everybody, let's get our questions on the chat, but if you can as well, do lift up your hand so that we can give you an opportunity to participate in the conversation with Ken. As we do that, Ken, the first question I'll start off is, you talk about the livelihoods bit, and we do, many of us that work on the front line in practice in conservation do think a lot about that. And from your work, do you have any ideas of how we can diversify and develop more meaningful livelihoods for people there? And any experience and comment on that would be really, really useful.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we as scientists, we're very good at looking at problems and identifying problems. We're not so good at actually coming up with answers to them, I'm afraid. Obviously, what I'm talking about here is, and you know, my work is generally much more in agricultural development in general. But I've always had this very strong interest and also commitment, if you like, to biology and conservation. And so it's, if you like, a personal passion. Maybe I learned actually in Zimbabwe, you never give an answer to a question, you tell a story. Yeah? I mean, this is a normal African way. So I'll tell you some story, I'll come back to an answer. But when I was in Tanzania, I spent 4 or 5 months in Tanzania in 2015, and I was in Arusha, but working and discussing a lot with TNC, the Nature Conservancy. And one of the things you see there very much is a continual settlement on all of the older migration routes, where many of the Maasai and others are building homesteads and putting fences around in different places. So if you like, the opposite of the idea of free movement for animals. And you see, basically, population is mopping up all of these areas in areas that really aren't suitable for agriculture. But people are settling there, they're staking a claim, because land, of course, has much more meaning in terms of property and possession than just production. I think that the trajectories that we see at the moment are terrifying for the future, because in many of those areas, population growth rates are incredibly high. And in those areas, TNC actually were working together with local bodies, providing reproductive health planning, family planning and the like. They had uptakes in the villages where they worked of over 90% by Maasai women who basically wanted to control their families but didn't have access to basic health care. I mean, I think one of our problems is we can't see this as a conservation issue. It's actually an issue to do with broader economic development in the countries. And, you know, certainly in Zimbabwe with the economic collapse, I mean, that has tended to push people back towards the edges because of the lack of opportunity elsewhere. So a development of the economy, a development of jobs, of a better life for people in the main is going to be positive for conservation. But as long as those opportunities aren't there, either in Zimbabwe or across the border in Botswana and South Africa, then the pressure will be back in those remote areas. And I think we've got to get it into our heads that we can't just fiddle around at the edges, you know, worrying about what's going on there. It's part of a much, much bigger problem. And we need to be vocal in that, I think, from a conservation standpoint. So I didn't give an answer to your question, I think.
Excellent. I think you've given an answer. Last time when Edson was around, someone added that I think it must have been Jens who was saying people need to get involved in politics and the conversation for political change. Other questions would really, Tim, there you are.
Yeah, sorry to steal the question time, but please do add questions if you have any to the chat, or raise your hand or unmute yourself. We welcome questions. I was really struck, Ken, by the point on of off-farm income and coming. You know, I come from a conservation background and a biology background, and we kind of just think of these people in rural areas as making an income from subsistence farming, and we don't really think beyond that. And even in the terms of intervening for alternative livelihoods, it's kind of often farm-based livelihoods.
Yeah, sure.
I was just really struck by, I think it was the Tanzanian graph that almost all the people who were actually earning a living income and were able to live with the basic human rights met, all seem to have, or most of them seem to have off-farm income. And I just wondered, apart from the remittances that you mentioned, what some of these alternatives are. Although I am aware you said that.
No, sure. No, it's a really good point.
Yeah.
So Tim, one of the other things we've realized, and this year we've got the World, the Food Systems Summit, a global food systems summit all around the SDGs. And I've been involved in writing one of the main reports going into that, looking at farming and farming futures around the world. What we find is farmers everywhere nearly have more than one income. Here in the Netherlands, usually within a farming household, there's one person who's working in town, you know, maybe the wife working as a secretary. So it sounds terribly sexist, but it's often the case, while the man farms, or they have a tourist tea room, or they have a golf course, or they have here They have windmills for electricity. Many farmers are making as much money out of generating electricity as they are out of farming. So when you look across the globe, there aren't so many farming households that depend purely on farming. And in Europe, of course, we have subsidies to farmers for nature preservation or for biodiversity on farm. They're worth something around 200 to 300 euros per hectare. And there are very few African farmers who would ever earn 200 to 300 euros per hectare from their land. Yeah, so it's a very uneven world in terms of the quality of the playing field, if you like, for farming. But the idea that farmers are just farmers or farming households are just farmers, I think we need to escape from. So in that Tanzania example, very often you sit and talk to a household and they'll have 2 or 3 sons who'll be working in the cities down on the coast in Tanga or in Dar es Salaam. They'll have some livestock producing milk, they'll have some vegetables. So they have a whole range of different activities, including sometimes menial work, food for work programs, building roads, other things. And they patch together their livelihood from all the different things that they can find. And I think, you'll find what we found down in Sengwe particularly, and obviously Sengwe is very close down to Beitbridge, very close to the border with South Africa. Most of the households there, they were hardly bothering with farming. We're there as agriculturalists saying, if you do this extra work, you can get more yield. And they're saying, yeah, as long as we can buy stuff in the supermarket or there is a shop, then, we'll do that. Because of course, South Africa is such an important part of the Zimbabwean economy. Botswana is such an important part of the Zimbabwean economy because of people working elsewhere and sending money back. And I mean, the economy in Zimbabwe, if you cut off all the remittances, it would grind to a halt at the moment, yeah? So the problem is, in many ways, it's such an intertwined problem because we're talking here about such a large proportion of the population who are involved in farming, but also want job opportunities as well, that we've got to see agriculture as part of the solution, but it can't lift the economies in the way that many African governments argue, through CADAP, through the SADC policies. It's all about agricultural-led growth. Agriculture can help, but it has to go hand in hand with broader economic development off farm to provide the alternative jobs, and that feeds back into agriculture and vice versa. So I think the idea of a subsistence farmer is something we need to escape from. Nobody wants to subsist. Everybody wants a better life for their children through education, through whatever. Yeah.
Wow.
Thank you.
That's interesting. Christo, I shall give Christo the opportunity. He has a couple of more questions. So over to you, Christo. Good to see you.
Thank you. I'm going to be very short, and Ken, it's very nice to see you again. This whole idea of transformative change, and I've been working a bit with the Gaza Secretariat on this issue of land transformation, and they've got remote sensing data showing that if they can intensify agriculture, then actually they can reduce land transformation, which is of course good for wildlife. I'm not sold on that, to be honest, but I do see your data on transformative change almost implying exactly the opposite, that you really need a major expansion of agriculture. And my question is, seems like there are conflicting theories of change about what transformative change now means in the context of a sort of large transfrontier landscape. And I really would appreciate your opinion and that of others about it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe in my sort of conclusion slide is the giveaway that I think we need interventions on so many different fronts, Christo. I mean, for one thing, if we talk about agricultural productivity, both in terms of a yield per hectare, but also, if you like, in terms of economic productivity, we know we could get much more out of the land in terms of profit, in terms of production. Whether or not people will invest in that in a very risky environment without all of the backup of infrastructure, decent infrastructure, crop insurance, all those other things that farmers would normally take out in risky environments, it is a very moot question, I think. Obviously, in terms of markets, getting better access to markets, the institutions in terms of input provision, you need all of those things to line up. And, when I was preparing for this talk, I was thinking actually back to, there's this book about Zimbabwe's agricultural revolution from Mandy Rukuni and Carl Eicher from the 1990s. Because during the 80s, after independence, Zimbabwe went through a remarkable period of agricultural growth in the smallholder sector. It went through a remarkable period in terms of investment in local schools, in local health clinics and infrastructure in terms of rural roads, which I think you can look back on as being almost exemplary for Africa and for rural development in Africa, all through the 80s. Now, of course, what wasn't tackled at the time was this huge discrepancy, if you like, between then, of course, the large commercial farms and the smaller farms. There was little done apart from maybe some lip service, some small attempts in terms of land reform. And it's a real pity, of course, that led then to a broader demise later on in terms of the political conflict and everything. And of course, the loss of industry and the loss of jobs from Harare. So in a sense, you saw that period if you look back at that period during the 80s, there were so many different things going on in terms of job creation, in terms of development in the rural areas, in natural regions 2 and 3, particularly the wetter areas. And it just seems such a pity now looking back that if that had continued, then we might have seen a completely different situation in terms of the pressures around the parks. Did I answer your question, Krista? I'm not sure, but I talked quite a bit.
Well, no, it was good. I still think it's hanging in the air, and I do think it perhaps it's a difference in mental models about what transformative change means.
Krista, I mean, in those areas around Kaza, you're talking in whereabouts in particularly, in northern Botswana, or?
Yeah, more in the Zambezi region. In
the Zambezi, yeah. I mean, Fred Baudron, I'm not sure if Fred's still on the call. I know I see him there. He's got a fascinating study because during Fred's PhD, he showed very clearly that cotton and cotton production in the Midzanbazi around Mishumbi Pools in that area was a major driver of land clearance for agriculture. And in his PhD which is 10 years ago, 2011, he actually made a prediction that if cotton was to collapse, that would have a major effect of expansion of agriculture in the Midzanbazi Valley. Now, he predicted actually it would be an expansion of cereals, of small grains. Now, Fred just went back and did this study 10 years on, the same households, land use change, etc. And what he's seen is with the collapse of cotton, it's been an expansion of livestock, particularly small ruminants, a total destruction of wildlife habitat, complete loss of buffalo over the period, whereas there was a lot of buffalo in that area, very little effect on elephants, but maybe they're migrating through. But the effect on wildlife living in those areas or in the coexisting has been devastating because of the removal of habitat. And I think, let's hope Fred will give his talk to this group, because I think it's a really instrumental study, because it's looking at a strong agricultural change, but also looking on the impacts that they've been on wildlife.
Excellent. Fred, did you want to add anything to what Ken has said?
Hi, MX. No, not much to add. Yeah, no, indeed. I think that's something that we need to keep in mind in those areas, that we need people to, make a living beyond subsistence. And the cotton in the Midzanbazi Valley, at least in Bire, was really one of these enterprise. So yeah, I think this is all about the complexity that Ken mentioned in his talk. You could see cotton in that time, like 10, 13 years ago, as being a major driver of the loss of wildlife habitat, but you have to compare it with potential scenarios and potential alternative. And now switching to less labor-intensive enterprise, yeah, this is leading to even faster acceleration of land use change and loss of habitat. So yeah, just to reinforce this issue of complexity between in particular farming and nature, and this plea of Ken in his conclusion to have more connection, more talks between agricultural scientists and conservation in those working landscape or landscape share between people and wildlife. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. Ken, there has been a lot of talk about regenerative agriculture and going back to models of agroforestry and the like to try and address this whole thing about loss of the habitat and still being able to generate income and productivity. It would be good to get your view, because I think particularly in Europe, it's more and more becoming a big selling point, and people are interested in how we can do that.
So I just put a paper link in the chat. I was on a discussion this morning with a professor here, Liesje Momme, who's leading a Wageningen biodiversity initiative. And I see the name Jean Nell on the call. And I've never met Jean yet in person, but she works here in Wageningen, but from South Africa. But they're actually running a biodiversity initiative here. We're talking a lot to companies, because the companies are basically pushing very much for this idea of regenerative agriculture. Now, of course, it's got some wonderful things, because it's about increasing biodiversity, doing more agroforestry, doing all these wonderful things. But it's also about reducing inputs and potentially reducing yields. And when we look at agriculture in Europe, Fred used the slide yesterday, which shows, I think, Europe has gained 12 million hectares of forest in the last 20 years due to a reduction in the agricultural area. Well, that's great, isn't it? But the food, people are still eating and consuming just as much, if not more, which means that's coming from elsewhere, which means that we're helping to contribute to the destruction of the rainforest in Brazil. Yeah, the soy that's feeding the cattle here to produce the milk, which is then exported, is coming from Brazil. Our ecological footprint is globally having huge impacts elsewhere in the world. So the wealthy countries have got to be aware of that. And this is ignored in all the discussions here. And I've been on calls with the European Commission, listening to them and trying to hammer this. And there are people from Nature Conservancy, WWF, who are involved in these debates, who agree very much about the need for intensive agriculture in some places to avoid the need for land use change elsewhere. But it's not a great message that people in the public love to hear. They'd rather hear the word regenerative because it sounds good, yeah? And again, of course, these things can help and work in some places, but it's not a one answer for everywhere, yeah?
Thank you, Ken. Jean, the floor is yours. Do unmute and make your contribution.
Thank you, and thank
Switch
you,
your camera
Ken,
on.
for the. I'm standing. I'm just coming back from the station, and I've been driving. Cycling my bike back. So I just pulled off to a quiet place. So hopefully you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Ken, for the lovely talk. I really loved the complexity and nuanced message that you gave, which is not sometimes the thing that you hear here. You hear these polarized debates. You either need land sharing or you need land sparing. And And there are many debates that I'm just very tired of hearing the polar opposites on. So I really thank you for your nuanced presentation. And I just wanted to pick up on something that Christo said about the transformative change. And I was wondering, I'm definitely, I like your conclusions that we need everything. We just need to try a diversity of things. And I really like this idea that we should move away from the subsistence idea, that it's not the poor rural farmer and sustainable, I mean, that agricultural yield is not going to uplift people from poverty. One of the things that I find a little bit alarming is if you start talking in terms of transformative change. I understand where you're coming from, but if you start talking about sustainable intensification and really increasing and ramping up agriculture, my fear is that we're still not addressing the structural big issues that you've been talking about, like the universal basic income, or pulling people out of poverty, or it again gets shifted all the way through to the agricultural field and the local farmer. And for me, there's a lot of overwhelming, I don't even know how to tackle it, but structural issues to do with things like you mentioned, like the subsidies and the unfair balance and playing field you have, even when you start producing agriculture. And I was just wondering whether you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, how do we stop becoming all terribly despondent and giving up? You know, I mean, this is my problem, and because I do feel depressed about many of these things, and I spend all of my working life, you know, sort of grappling with this and moving more and more, if you like, into the policy arena on it, because trying to hammer away there. You know, we're being faced all the time at the moment with the discussion that the food system is broken. We've got to fix the food system. But the food system is part of the broader economic system. The farming system is part of the broader food system. You know, I mean, it's all part of the same thing. As long as the economics of our society, which is creating greater and greater inequality, which we see the whole time, unless we start to address some of these fundamentals, then we can't get back to the root of the problem. So, I mean, it is all stacked up, you know, and I think there are some signs, you know, if there's anything good come out of the pandemic, and I'm not sure there's much. One thing is that we engage more in these meetings across continents, so I can talk to all my friends here in Zimbabwe without actually, although I'd love to travel actually and be there. But the other side is that this awareness that during this terrible pandemic, there are these very, very small proportion of people globally who've got a hell of a lot richer by doing nothing. Almost enough that could have, you know, that could vaccinate the rest of the world. I mean, people maybe will start to sit up and listen a bit, because if we don't really address some of these fundamental issues, how on earth are we ever going to, you know, save wildlife in Southern Africa? I don't know. It is all linked, and we've got to start, I think, chipping away at it bit by bit. But I think for us to start with this recognition that for local people, they have broader needs and a broader livelihood, and we can't just think about, you know, giving them a new variety of maize or, you know, a little bit of fertilizer or something. I mean, that's a start. And, you know, Marshall Murphy was extremely complimentary about that conclusion from our book, and really saying, you know, and I respect him enormously, you know, this is where we've got to start. Yeah.
Wow, Ken, I can see lots of hands, including Jen's, saying that's a wonderful, wonderful way to put it. Lots to talk about.
Yeah, the diverse needs.
Yeah.
Exactly. I just want to probably give the last word to Agazela, the last question.
Thank you, MX. Ken, that was an interesting presentation. I wanted to ask, I'm actually in Hwange right now. So I wanted to ask, what's your take on the mining activities that are taking place in Hwange? given the COVID situation and the fact that they are creating employment for locals.
Yeah, I mean, there are some things you shouldn't do in parks, aren't there? I mean, I think that's quite clear. If it's really needed, you know, I mean, I think if we mining for coal in Hwangi, I don't see the sense of that. If we think globally, you know, everybody's trying to move towards a zero carbon economy and stop using coal. Obviously, you know, the energy situation in Zimbabwe itself is a bit of a mess, I know, but I don't think we can countenance that. And I mean, I know that partly due to this lack of livelihood opportunity, you know, Fred Baudron was telling us that in the Midzanbazi Valley, people are now starting to pan in the rivers for gold. And again, a totally unproductive form of work, which is really going to lead to further devastation of the natural environment there. I mean, we need to find alternatives for people so they don't resort to doing things like that. Yeah. And yeah, the buck starts and stops really with government at the end of the day. So yeah, we need to highlight these issues and really get them onto the table. And I think for those of you in Zimbabwe, the more you can do to try and get messages into the newspaper or whatever, and you know, start to influence public opinion.
So yeah, gold panning has also ruined our growing with Nyash and his dad, because people make more.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ken. Can I just ask all of us, if you can, either through reaction or through the chat, just to say thank you to Ken for that wonderful presentation. Quite a lot of challenge, Ken, for many of us that are working in conservation and many of us in Zimbabwe, in different parts of the world, about the issues. And I like the fact that you've essentially said, let's get the fundamental issues right. If we can get those right, it will help us move forward. So once again, thank you very much. Can I ask?
MX, please don't be discouraged. Yeah. Diagnosis is the first part of cure. Yeah, we have to understand the problem before we can do something about it. So don't be discouraged. Keep pushing. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Right. Can I ask, if you can, wherever you are, if you can get onto your camera so that we can see you for a moment. Many of you have been off camera, which is totally understandable. But if you can, just want to see faces and excellent. And I'll ask Tim, as usual in this, before we end, we just love to get a photo of all of us together. And so if you can, do wave wherever you are. If you want to clap, please do so, as we just take Tim, if you can just get a photo of everybody.
I've got it.
On.
Thanks, guys. That was a great photo.
Thank you.
Tell me if you'd rather not be, I don't know where we might put it on the website or something, if you'd rather not be in.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So just as we come to the end, I just wanted to remind you of a couple of things. The first being the fact that we've got a website, zimscb.org. Please do go in there, sign up. We are keeping in touch with lots of people through the email, so please do sign up so that we can let you know of the things that we're doing. We have a number of speakers lined up, and Ken has indicated, hopefully we'll have people like Fred, Andy Loveridge, Johan is here lined up for speaking in the future. A good friend of mine, Itai, the chief aquatic ecologist, also lined up. So we have a variety of topics and people coming through to speak on this. We would like to know from you what you'd like to hear most about. So please feel free to get in touch with us about the kind of topics and people that you'd like to see on our series. If you'd like to offer yourself, we're very happy do consider that, please do get in touch with myself, with team, with the whole team on our website about that as well. Sadly, just want to continue plugging in the ICCB conference in Rwanda. Please do have a look at their website, register, and plan to participate if you can. And the last thing that we just wanted to say to all of us is that if you can, please do get in touch. We've got a number of projects that we are doing, a horizon scan. We've got the strategy development, finalizing that. If you'd like to be part of that, we would be very glad to have a lot of input from you. But for today, we would like to say thank you for attending, and a particular thank you to Ken for such a delightful talk, full of challenge, and yet as well as he concluded, encouragement to many of us that are doing stuff on the ground, whether on the agricultural front or on the conservation front as well. So want to say thank you. This is a seminar series. We will be letting you know when our next seminar will be in June. Please do keep an eye for that, and keep your open your emails when you see an email from the Zim SCB chapter. We will be communicating about that. But thank you very much for attending, and we're very glad to have had you, Ken. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity. It's been a real pleasure. Go well. I hope to keep in touch in future with your society as well.
Thank you. We would appreciate that. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.